and I'm sure I speak for the majority of Labour Party members here, when I say, whatever is the situation, there is no place for that type of sentiment in our party.
Okay, let's talk about another big issue facing Britain. The vote coming up. It's about 5-6 weeks off right now. The polls, leave the EU, stay in the EU, are within a margin of error, Mr. Prime Minister. How is that going to go down? Will Britain leave the EU?
Well, I want to say confidently that I think we will stay. Okay. But, you've got to look around the world today, and it's an unpredictable place politically. So I believe that we will stay. I think that's the rational thing. This is the biggest commercial market in the world. We sell half of our goods into it. It's the biggest political alliance in the world. Our allies round the world, the people here at this conference, would regard it as a very foolish and unwise risk to take to leave. So I believe we will stay. But, you've got to qualify this today by saying politics is in an uncertain state. You can see it here.
It is one of the Brexit, as they call it. I detest that term, but the Brexit, as they call it, is one of the biggest topics here, because this is not an England issue. This is a global issue. There's real fear among some of the folks that we've talked to here last night, the dinner panel that we had. What will happen? Our Federal Reserve may be waiting to see what happens in England. What do you think would happen if the vote is approved? What happens to the British economy, to the EU, to the United States?
I think we face a prolonged period of uncertainty, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't just affect us in Britain, it affects Europe, and it affects the global economy. And one of the things I think is actually quite important is that people back home see what comes out of conferences like this, when here you've got probably some of the biggest investment institutions, pension funds, the big institutional investors. Most of them globally are here, and as far as I can make out, there only is one view, which is this would be a really bad idea.
But yet,
and there is a dissatisfaction with politics, which is, I think, a global phenomenon. And in addition to that, it's not that Europe doesn't require reform now, because there's lots of things that should change in Europe, but the best way to do that is for Britain to be in Europe, leading that case for change, and not out of it and powerless.
There is a wave of populism around the world, and you look at Europe, and you look at the rise of the far right in France, and to a point in Germany. You look at Golden Dawn in Greece,
right?
Basically a neo-Nazi party that actually has members in parliament. You've got this migrant crisis, millions of people dislocated. How does it look 5 years from now?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it depends on the decisions we take. But I think in Europe, we've got to take the big decisions that are necessary to sort out the Eurozone, continuing anxieties and worries about the economy and the banking system. And I think it requires a big plan to do that, and not just a series of incremental steps. And then I think on the security side, we have to have the right combination of measures, military and other, that are going to take on this security issue and really deal with it. But it's, these are big challenges, and they're challenges where, unlike when I was first starting in politics, and it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and, the global economy looked in reasonable shape, decision-making at that point looked relatively steady and relatively predictable. If you fast forward 20 years to today, we live in an era of almost extraordinary unpredictability.
And also, I would say that time was an era of it seemed like extraordinary optimism. The wall is down, countries are opening up, there's work to do, but we're rising. It feels like we're caught in this global wave of pessimism and negativity. How do we get out of that?
Well, I think we partly get out of it, by the way, in taking a step back and understanding that if you look at the broad sweep of history, even over the last 20 years, there have been hundreds of millions of people globally lifted out of poverty. Okay. But if you take our societies, I think there is a real sense amongst middle and lower income families that their incomes are flatlining, that they're not sure that their children are going to do as well as them, never mind do better than them. And, there are two types of politics in the world today. There are what I call the politics of the anger and the politics of the answer. And the politics of the anger are very easy for populists to ride, left and right. And the curious thing is, by the way, which I notice both sides of the Atlantic, is the populism of the left and right at certain points they meet, but they aren't answers. The answer is not to try and... Globalization is a fact, right? Technological advance is a fact. These things are going to carry on changing the world. The real question is, what are the solutions and answers that allow us to access the opportunities and minimize the risks?